In almost 50 years of researching and investigating claims of the weird and unusual, I've heard some pretty wild stories. Like the woman who claimed her husband and daughter were both werewolves, or another who said that a group of fairies were riding the back of her dog like a horse as she spoke to me on the phone, or the 60-year-old woman who claimed she was pregnant with Satan's child. But in terms of another piece of the paranormal puzzle known as Bigfoot, there are a laundry list of bizarre stories. But there is one that stands out to me as perhaps the weirdest one of them all. So break out your tree-knocking sticks and practice your howls, because this story is extremely strange. In 1924, young Swedish immigrant Albert Osman was a blue-collar logging and construction worker who held various jobs in those industries throughout his life. After spending a year on one, he thought it would be a good time to take a vacation and chose to explore British Columbia's many rumored gold mines. But if it's true that there's gold in them thar hills, then Albert Osman got much more than he bargained for when he encountered a legendary creature that was just as interested in staking its own claim on him. One such mine was said to exist at the head of the Toba Inlet, and Albert took a Union steamship to Lund, British Columbia, where he hired an old native guide to take him there. The old man proved to be great company, as he was the talkative type, and told stories of gold being found in the mine by another white man who was a heavy drinker and a big saloon spender, but always seemed to acquire more gold after a few days out in the mine. This cycle continued until one day he went off in search of more gold and never returned. The old man told Albert it was rumored he had been killed by a Sasquatch, a name and creature that Albert was unfamiliar with at that time. When asked to describe this being, the native told of its body being covered with hair, but not a normal animal, in reality a different type of human being. He related the story of an uncle finding footprints over 2 feet long, and another indigenous man seeing one he said was over 8 feet tall. A skeptical Osterman told the man he didn't believe in native stories about hairy men, and that while similar creatures might have lived thousands of years ago, they were long gone by now. The old native admitted there might not be many left, but insisted some individuals still remained. They eventually arrived at the inlet, where Albert set up camp and invited his guide to share supper with him. When they finished, he asked the old man to check back on him in 3 weeks' time at this same spot, and with that they parted ways. The following morning, Albert set out on his quest for the lost mine, leaving his equipment at the campsite, save for his .30-30 Winchester rifle, which he took along with him. He followed a mountain pass where he looked for signs of a trail but found none existed there. He later headed back to camp and packed for the following day, making sure to include his custom-made prospecting pick and his sheath knife. He then visited a shop in Lund where he picked up some cans to hold his supplies and purchased some provisions for the trip, as well as a box of shells for the rifle. With that, he rolled up his sleeping bag and a few pots and brought them back to camp. In the morning, Albert had an early breakfast and set off, his fully stocked backpack weighing in excess of 80 pounds. Between hiking, climbing, and resting, it was 2 p.m. when he came to a flat piece of ground below a bluff rock, where he formed a primitive shovel out of some willow and dug for water. When he hit the groundwater table, he set up camp there for the night. He was at an elevation of around 1,000 feet, and the view was breathtaking as he looked out into the strait and saw tugboats and fishing boats moving through the water in all directions. He resumed his hike, repeating the same process of finding underground springs where he could set up camp for the night before continuing on. At this point, there was no sight of any mineral deposits, but by the following day he had made it over a mountain pass where the terrain would be downhill from there. After a 10-mile trek, his next stop was near a small spring and a hemlock tree, where he spent the next 2 days alternating prospecting and resting. He also shot a small deer, which was a welcome change from the food he had brought along. It was 2 days later when he found an exceptional site where there was shade and another spring. He decided right then this would be his permanent camp, and set things up in a way he described later as classy. It was at this point that things began to take a very bizarre turn. Albert had always been a heavy sleeper, and not much could disturb him once he drifted off. So he was quite surprised when he awoke the following morning to see that the camp had been disturbed during the night. Nothing seemed to have gone missing, so he had breakfast and went about his day. Still a bit wary, he filled the magazine of the rifle and kept extra shells in his pocket. He kept the weapon under his sleeping bag. The following morning he found his backpack had been emptied out, as if someone had turned it upside down and dumped the contents out. He found that a half can of prunes and some pancake flour were missing. There were no tracks around the campsite, and he doubted that it could have been a bear because they tended to really make a mess of things. But from that day on, he stood close to camp to catch the intruder in the act. For 3 nights these nocturnal visits continued, and Albert took note of where everything was placed. He would sleep fully clothed, only taking his shoes off, with his rifle always within reach. He had determined he would stay up all night to catch the culprit, but eventually drifted off to sleep. He was awakened by the feeling of being lifted or picked up, and at first the sensation didn't register as he was still in the throes of sleep. He was able to recall where he was and at first feared a snowslide, but there was no snow on the ground. He described his next feeling as if being thrown onto a horse, but whatever he was traveling on was walking. As he was still in his sleeping bag, he tried to reach for his knife, but it was underneath him and couldn't get to it, but did manage to get his hands on his rifle as whatever was carrying him continued on. A long period of time went by when he felt both of them going uphill, and whatever this was breathing hard from the effort. Albert then had a thought. Could it be whatever had him was one of those Sasquatches the old native had told him about? Osman was being carried in a very awkward position and was essentially unable to move at all. The inside of the sleeping bag was very hot, and the position of his limbs was now becoming uncomfortable to the point of pain. At least there was a small opening at the top of the bag to allow some air inside. Now they were going downhill, and at times what this thing was dragged him on the ground at various points. Then the pace grew faster, and the pain Albert was feeling increased. At this point, he just wanted the trip to end and to reach whatever destination they were bound for. Now going uphill again, Albert estimated they had been moving like this for close to 3 hours. Then at last they stopped, and Albert was set down. At this point he heard what he described as chattering, but could not make out words. He stuck his head out of the sleeping bag to get some air, but couldn't stand as his legs had gone completely numb. It was now pitch black, and Ostman could not get a good look at his captor and tried to get some feeling back in his legs and get his shoes on. As the chattering continued, he claimed there were now 4 of these beings around him, and realized now that yes, indeed, the existence of Sasquatch was not a native fairy tale. His first instinct was naturally to escape, and when he finally got his boots on, he asked with rifle in hand, "What you fellows want with me?" But the question was met only with more indistinguishable chatter. Daylight was quickly coming, and Albert was able to see them clearly now. There were indeed 4 of them, 2 full-grown adults and 2 small ones, all covered in hair and none wearing clothing. It was now 4:25 a.m. Small ones is a relative term, as the young male was estimated to be around 7 feet tall and about 300 pounds, with a 50-plus inch chest according to Albert. They all had wide jaws, narrow foreheads, with skulls slanted upwards. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long, but shorter on their bodies. The adult female was also said to be somewhere around 7 feet tall, weighing 500 to 600 pounds. His kidnapper, the adult male, was estimated to be well over 8 feet tall and somewhere near 1,000 pounds. All were powerfully built, with both males having massive physiques with enormous chests and biceps. The only place they had no hair was on their palms and the soles of their feet, as well as the upper part of the nose and eyelids. All had very large feet and turned their knees outward and just lowered their bodies as they sat down. No hands or arms were needed to stand up. It became clear that he was in the midst of what appeared to be a family. An adult male and female and 2 little ones, a boy and a girl, both of whom seemed frightened of him. The adult female seemed agitated, and while the male waved his arms around as if trying to explain himself, they all eventually left him. Albert used the compass he had brought to try to get a read on his location. He was in a small valley surrounded by mountains and saw where he had been brought in. This would be his opportunity to escape, but the adult male was now sitting near that opening. He took what belongings he had brought in his backpack and moved them near a stone wall. There were 2 cypress trees he figured he could use for shelter until he found a way out of this situation. He checked the food he had brought and made certain his sheath knife and rifle were ready to use at a moment's notice if in any way these creatures approached in a threatening manner. With the 2 young offspring watching him warily from behind a juniper bush, Albert decided he had to find water at some point, and he saw some lush ground which might signal its presence. He found a nearby spring where he filled his canteen and set about making some coffee for himself. When he returned, the young male was looking at his belongings, though he didn't touch anything. Albert spotted the area where the creatures must spend the night, which was on a mountain shelf that was covered with dry moss, with what resembled blankets woven from cedar bark and packed with moss. He had the impression the accommodations must keep them very warm. Not much of note took place that first day. Albert ate a cold supper, and the young male grew ever more curious about him. He tossed the child a snuff box, which the youngster grabbed quickly, displaying both speed and agility. He then showed the box to his sister, and both played with it for quite a long period of time before he brought it to the adult male. They spent a considerable amount of time speaking in that now familiar chatter Ostman was hearing. By the following morning, Albert was determined to leave, his sense of wonderment about the creatures be damned. He planned to just travel downhill until he came across some form of civilization. So he packed his belongings, tossed the bag over his shoulders, injected a shell into his rifle, and began to take leave of his unusual hosts. And with that, the adult male stood and held out both arms, as if ready to physically restrain him from doing so. Ostman gestured toward the opening to display his intentions, but the adult verbalized something that to Albert sounded like "suka suka," which made him retreat about 60 feet. He was prepared to shoot his way out, but had reservations as to how damaging his .30-30 might be to this massive being. If it just made him mad, Albert was a goner, so he decided to wait. Besides, he was having some doubts as to whether he wanted to bring any harm to these creatures who, beyond kidnapping him, had shown little to no aggression toward him. He thought the youngsters might help him, but communication was obviously an issue. He came up with a risky plan of leaving a few grains of snuff in the box, and hopefully the adult male might decide to try it. Albert could then attempt to blow or toss some into its eyes, effectively blinding it and allowing him to escape. The problem after that was he still wasn't sure where exactly he was, but he surmised the creature had carried him in a northeasterly direction, as any other would have led them toward the ocean. The adult female had scarcely been seen to this point, but she showed up carrying an armful of grass and twigs along with some nuts, so she had clearly been foraging. The young boy gave Albert a taste of some grass with long sweet roots, which Albert enjoyed immensely. He handed over his snuff box, which the boy tasted, and then handed to his father, who licked at it with his tongue. With that, the chattering began again. It was apparent that the father enjoyed snuff, and Albert thought he might take advantage of that by having him ingest so much it might make him physically ill or even kill him. By this time, 6 days had passed since he'd been brought here. Osman knew he eventually had to leave and hoped they would understand this. He was not being mistreated in any way, but enough was enough. And at this point, he still didn't have any idea what they wanted from him or what was to become of him. The adult male was growing more interested in Albert's use of snuff and would come closer to him each day that passed. One morning, Albert started a small fire and made coffee, and both males sat down within 10 feet of him. As he ate breakfast, he embellished the pleasure he was getting from the food he ate, and when he finished, he pulled out his snuff box and took a big chew of it into his mouth. The adult male suddenly reached for it and emptied the entire contents into his mouth. It became apparent quite soon the creature was becoming sick from ingesting the substance, and Albert claimed he poured the entire pot of coffee into his mouth, which did little good. He began to roll around in discomfort as he began to loudly squeal, and headed quickly toward the nearby spring to drink some water and flush out the snuff from his system. With that, Albert grabbed his rifle and bolted toward the opening of the camp, fully intending to shoot the male if he came after him. The young male began chattering to its mother, who ran after him, forcing Albert to fire a shot over her head at a large rock. The sound of this mysterious object was enough to scare her back into their camp, and Albert then ran as fast as he could, downhill into a canyon, peering back over his shoulder once in a while to make sure they were not pursuing him. Eventually, he recognized Mount Baker in the distance, which signaled he was headed the right way back into civilization. On his way down, he shot a grouse, which he roasted and ate for supper, as he now felt safe enough to make a fire and hunker down for the night. The next morning, his feet were very sore and his stomach was upset, likely from the bird he consumed the night before. But he then began the arduous climb up the mountain, concerned he might not make it to the top. But eventually he did, though it took 6 hours to do so. Now going downhill, within 2 hours, he heard the sound of a motor running as he entered a logging site. He came across some workers there and told him he was out prospecting and gotten lost. He thought better of telling the truth to the men, who he surmised would have thought him crazy. A day later, Albert made his way from the Sechelt Inlet and caught a Union boat back to Vancouver. This would be his last prospecting trip, and the final time he would ever encounter or view a Sasquatch. His non-belief in them was now permanently altered, and remained that way until his death at a rest home in 1975. Now, as you can imagine, researchers have nitpicked Osman's story to death, even going so far as claiming the terrain doesn't jive with the way it looks today. But bear in mind, 40 years have passed since he first shared his story with noted Canadian Bigfoot researcher John Green. But in any event, the discrepancies that were found were actually quite minor, which leads us to two conclusions. Number one, the whole story is made up, because for whatever reason, Osman was trying to cover up what actually happened to him while being miles away from his original campsite, which was witnessed by the native guide that he hired. Or, Albert Osman indeed encountered a family of creatures that defied the imagination and gives credence to the idea that a population of bipedal ape-like beings exists in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, as well as other locations throughout the continental United States. And look, we've all seen enough grainy photographs and videos to last us a lifetime, and we've read about hoaxes being perpetuated about the existence of Bigfoot. But if a thinking, reasoning primate can choose to conceal their presence from human beings, then certainly the possibility does exist that Albert Osman and many others who followed, who laid claim to seeing such creatures, shouldn't be so easily dismissed.